I grew up in a small town. My house was one of the oldest ones in the town. We lived right beside three sets of train tracks. Growing up, I always heard voices. My friend heard them too in my house. They weren't regular voices, it's hard to explain. But if she didn't hear them with me, I would have passed it off as my imagination. It was only words here and there, but they came across like a dream. We heard them, but we knew they weren't there, like a fast car zooming by. It was always a man, and we never knew what exactly he was saying. It was a regular occurrence when I was growing up that stuff would fly off the back of the toilet and hit the opposite wall in our bathroom. My mum finally told them to shut up, and it stopped. When I was about 12, my parents and my brother went to my brother's hockey game at the local arena. I stayed at home and had a bath. Our bathroom was on the left of a hallway, with the washer and dryer on the right, and a door leading to an old office room that had stairs going to the basement. As I was having my bath, I heard heavy boot steps come up the stairs towards the back door. All of a sudden they stopped. And then they were outside of the bathroom door, and it sounded like something either kicked or punched the washing machine. It was loud. I was so scared I got dressed and ran away to a friend's house without leaving a note. I got used to the big guy and found out through his silhouette there was a woman in the house as well. She's not nice and hangs around the stairs. Even now, at 31 years of age, if I go up the stairs at my parents' house, I always have this horrible feeling that someone is behind me and wants to pull me down. I've never had that feeling anywhere else. My nephew is autistic and would talk to the ghosts. When my nephew was 4, he told my mom that the man's name is Sonny and that Sonny watches us. He told her that if we wanted to see Sonny, we would have to go down to the basement and dig. Sonny died falling on the train tracks. He doesn't like the woman and won't go up the stairs alone, so I don't know much about her, other than she is not nice. So this one isn't actually a story of one of my ghosts, but another one in another house. One of my oldest friends grew up in a house that apparently used to be a funeral home. She lived just a few houses down from mine, and it was very haunted. There was even a brick on the house that said "Dead House." It was there for as long as we can remember, so we don't know when it was written or who wrote it. Anywho, I spent the night one night. We were maybe 13 or 14 years old. She had 2 younger brothers. One was maybe 4 or 5 at the time, and the other was 2. We'd just woken up and we were just laying in bed, kind of talking, being lazy. We could hear her 2 younger brothers downstairs being typical noisy kids. We heard a female voice say, "Shh, you need to be quiet," and the boys went quiet. We figured her mom was downstairs with them, so we didn't think anything of it. A few minutes later, her mom walks in and asks us if we told the boys to be quiet. We told her no. We thought it was her. It wasn't her. We all just kind of went quiet, and her mom left the room and went downstairs. While this story is short and there isn't much to it, when we all realised that there was a woman downstairs talking to the boys, that everyone in the house heard speak and actually made the boys quiet down, it's always stuck with me. Like I said in my last post, we heard voices in my house, but they were always very quick and we could never understand exactly what was said. This voice was clear as day and loud enough to be heard in 2 rooms on another floor, like there was a living person there with them. In the end, it was nothing more than chilling. Late last night, around 11 p.m, my family and I returned home from the Lake District. We live on the southern coast of England. We had a pet sitter tend to our pets while we were gone, including my black cat. When we got home, he greeted me with cuddles and purring, but desperately wanted outside. We don't have a cat flat. There are a lot of foxes around us, and we have house rabbits too, so we don't risk it. Anyway, I hardly ever let him out at night, but I figured I'd sleep for an hour or 2, and then let him back in, but my husband was staying up a bit later. so I said to check their back door before coming to bed. I fell asleep and slept between an hour or two and got up. Everyone in the house was asleep, and I made my way down the upstairs landing. We have no natural light in the upstairs hall landing, as it's an old Victorian terraced house. It was very dark, so I left our bedroom door open to see a little. That's when I saw my cat. As I walked towards him, he turned and walked away from me. I thought he wanted food and my husband had let him back in. So, I followed him and continued to try and pick him up. But I couldn't catch him. For some reason, I all of a sudden had an eerie chill, so I reached for the lights. Nothing. No cat. I went downstairs into the back door and opened it, and my cat ran in. So, what was I following upstairs? I will say, I don't really creep out over ghosts, etc., as it's not a new thing for me. But it is for this house. We've lived here for 2 years and I haven't seen anything. The house is 120 years old though, so who knows what it was, and why it wanted to follow me. I was at my in-laws' house, alone, for a few hours doing laundry. Beautiful, clear day outside. All of a sudden, I heard an adult male voice exclaim, "Oh shit!" in an angry tone, almost like someone had stubbed their toe. The thing is, there was no substance to the voice. Like if somebody were to call out that loudly, you can sort of feel or tell where it's coming from, or there would be an echo. I couldn't tell where exactly the sound was coming from, but it sounded like it was off in the distance or downstairs. No echo. It was just very flat and strange. I had been very obviously there for at least 2 hours at that point, and wearing combat boots, so if someone had been downstairs, they would have easily heard me clomping around long before then. That was not my first weird encounter at this house. Previously, I had a closet door slam on my back a different time I was there alone a few months ago. This time, I thought I was hearing things, except I heard it clear as day and it was pretty loud. I sternly replied, "Get the fuck out and don't fucking swear in my house," and opened the front door hoping it would leave. I sat outside on the steps for a moment and waited, called my boyfriend in a panic, and decided I was going to stop with the laundry and just grab my things and leave. Just in case someone had broken into the house and was in the basement where the voice may have come from. I closed the door, took a few steps over to my bag, and as soon as I had my hand on my purse, there was a loud crash from directly beneath me in the basement. It shook the floor, and the whole house like a large piece of furniture had tipped over. I ran out of the house and took off in my car, leaving the laundry. My boyfriend has had strange experiences over the years in that house, the house that he grew up in, but he's numb to it, so I don't think whatever it is targets him anymore, because he can ignore it. I don't have a ton of experience with paranormal, although I do believe there was a ghost in a condo we used to live in. Things would be moved around, and my hair would get pulled on several occasions. I think whatever that spirit was just trying to get a rise out of me. That was years ago, and I haven't had any weird experiences after leaving that apartment. This time felt different. I felt vulnerable, like I was in danger if I stayed. I have only lived in 2 houses my whole life, but both have been haunted. To preface this, I want to say I am not influenced by scary movies since I avoid them like the plague. I'm a fraidy cat, always have been, so I don't need spooky movies making me terrified. I'll start with the house I lived in from the time I was born until I was 19. This house had 3 bedrooms, a super creepy basement, and just always seemed dark. The experiences start with my brother, who is 4 years older than me. As a child, he would often see a soldier marching towards him wherever he was on the property. It terrified him for a long time before my very religious dad did something and that particular activity stopped. Though this did not stop my brother from having horrible night terrors for a long time, he would scream and cry but couldn't be woken up. Skipping ahead to my own experiences, I will start with the most frequent one. I shared a room with my sister until I was 12, she was 14. Naturally, we didn't get along great, but we respected each other's space. She made me sleep in the bed by our door, so I looked out into the hallway.
We always kept our door mostly closed at night, but with a crack open to let our cat in to sleep wherever she wanted. I never told my sister because I didn't want to scare her, but like clockwork from the time I was 8, I would wake up in the middle of the night and see a man looking into our bedroom at me. He always stayed half hidden behind our door, but would just stand there staring. I tried to explain it away as my dad checking in on us, but since we shared a vent with my parents' rooms, I could easily hear him snoring while the man watched us. Time passed, and after my parents divorced, I didn't notice this activity again. I pretty much pushed it to the back of my mind when at 16, my sister's boyfriend at the time spent the night in our creepy basements. There was a bedroom down there, though no door on it since it was rarely used. He'd ended up staying late at our house, so was off to that room to sleep in. The next morning, he seemed disturbed, so I asked him what was wrong, and he kinda tried shrugging it off and saying it was nothing. I insisted he tell me, and when he finally did, I was horrified. All night, there had been a man peeking at him from behind our water heater that sat in the far end of the basement across from the bedroom. I confided with him and my sister about what I'd seen for the years her and I shared a room, and we all agreed it was super creepy. A couple years later, my sister and brother told me that sometimes in the middle of the night, they'd wake up to me muttering, sitting up straight in bed. They tried to get me to stop playing annoying older siblings while actually being freaked out since my eyes were always closed. Though apparently they never could make me stop or wake up. I would eventually snap my head in whatever direction they were in and, in their words, growl at them to get out. I've never been afraid of walking in the dark in any house other than that one. It's unnerving but not terrifying in any way. But turning off the lights and going up the very dark stairs to my room always felt a bit scarier. There was one night in particular that stands out. I'd walked down those dark stairs without a problem, but when it came to walk back up, I just went cold with dread. I was staring at the dark space of the landing and I just knew something was there. The house was old and of course there were spots that creaked when you stepped on them, but that landing never made phantom creaking noises unless someone was on it. So when I heard it creak as if someone was adjusting their weight, I turned on every light I could, not caring if I woke up my dad, and for the first time in 3 years, I prayed. What convinced me this event was paranormal in nature is that I've never been struck motionless with fear before. The stairs in particular unnerved me, but not so much that I felt in danger, just being near them. Besides that, lights have randomly come on, the most notable being the one on a dimmer switch. I couldn't put anything on my walls because it would always fall off, and things constantly went missing only to turn up right when I got annoyed when I couldn't find them. For the most part, the experiences in that house were more annoying, but they could suddenly take a sinister and terrifying turn at any given moment. That house seemed to bring you down, leave you depressed and angry. Whatever was in that house was all wrong. Onto my new house, I moved halfway across the country with my boyfriend into a small 3 bedroom house. It's a comfy place and one I instantly felt more comfortable in than my previous home. At first, nothing happened. Then one day, I was all alone in our bedroom when, plain as day, it looked like someone lifted my kitten and gently placed her on the bed next to me. At the time, he was in a corner against the wall. I was sitting up in that corner of the bed against the wall, reading, when I looked up and saw her back arched and her feet slightly above the mattress as she freaking glided over to me. It freaked me out. I couldn't rationalize this, so I just picked her up and went downstairs while my boyfriend was playing video games. One day when I was in my backyard, I saw a light left on in the small bedroom that had become my office. I knew I'd turned it off, and the door is always closed so my cats don't knock anything fragile over. I decided to go in and turn it off, leaving my boyfriend outside, only to walk upstairs and see the door wide open and the light now off. I closed the door, made sure it wouldn't happen again, then went back outside and didn't say anything. Suddenly, that particular door opening became a regular thing until one day I walked in there and decided to try asking it to stop. I just said, "Can you keep this door closed, please? It's so the cats don't break anything." After that, the door stopped turning up open. My boyfriend is in the army, so naturally he spends some time away from home. On one such night, I was sleeping when at about 2 in the morning I heard a smash. Now, this is the day I realized I am fearless when still sleepy. I grumbled down those stairs, pissed to be woken up, and peeked into my kitchen, angry at the cat for knocking things off the counter. I didn't see anything at first, but once I stepped into the kitchen, I stepped directly onto broken glass. Thankfully, I didn't cut myself, so I cleaned it up and went back to bed. It wasn't until the next morning that I realised, one, the glass was in the centre of the kitchen, and two, it was all piled into one place, every last shard, like it had already been swept into that space. I scoured the kitchen looking for any more glass and didn't find anything. The last bigger experience I had was when I fell asleep on the little futon in my office. I was relaxing in there and reading late one night and fell asleep when suddenly I woke up. I wasn't scared, just felt like I was in the way or being annoying. Like after midnight, I should be in my own room. I had to wonder if maybe that room was claimed by whoever or whatever is in my house. Like they're okay if I use it, but when it's bedtime, I should just be in my own bed. I don't think the presence in this house is malicious. Rather, I find it very helpful at times. When my cats are getting into something they shouldn't be in, I've seen them get pushed away, like someone is using their front foot to get them away from whatever they shouldn't be messing with. They seem to help the cats too. I know the cats have gotten stuck in the bathroom, accidentally being closed in, and I'll hear a small knocking sound on whatever room I'm in until I let the cat out. This at first unsettled me, but now it's just very helpful and nice. Sometimes I also get a very strong feeling to check our door before bed, and every single time I get that feeling, it's unlocked. I like my doors locked at night, so this has been very helpful. Many of you paranormal enthusiasts may have already heard by now the word Nahul. No mistaking with Nahul, which is a native people here in Mexico, and I would guess that on also some other countries in Latin America. We call that way to people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, it was a cold night. I remember because it was really odd around that zone of the country. My parents' house is in a small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses on the outsides of town, so not many neighbours, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard, where we used to have sheep, and on one side, a small water stream, and trees to the side. Suddenly, the sheep started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on the window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and smoothing his voice, he told to my mom, "Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." There were four brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell what he saw. In the barnyard, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were heaped just in one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense. But he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one of the sheep there. The one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep inside of the house and keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. Mal air in Spanish. So he made some kind of prayer, holding his machete. On his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. They went outside. My grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Go away, you have nothing to do here, leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, like eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and rise its head up towards my family. This being was only staring at them, not a single noise, also not red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock he picked up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but apparently this being was not that strong. Or maybe because on our side were 6 men armed with machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned his back and ran away into the forest, running on 4 legs like an animal would do. This was when they came closer to the sheep. They saw how the sheep on the ground was still alive, but completely unskinned. It was horrifying to say the least. My grandfather sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend who was known for being quite an old man, but still working on heavy farm labor, even heavier than young men, and that used to practice sorcery to heal people, told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was in Nahul. He told us he'd spoken to the man and asked him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar like that. My house was built in the 1950s, But the land had been in my family since before the Civil War. There was a farmhouse there before the war, which was burnt down. I live in the southern United States. So my house wasn't old, but the land and the history sure was. My ancestors were white farmers who helped run escaped slaves up north before and during the war. We've always been proud of our civil rights involvement. My grandmother marched in several demonstrations in the 60s. This is all just background info. Let's get to the apparitions. My great aunt was as sensitive, as was my great grandmother, and my mom, though mom wasn't as sensitive as the other women in the family. I got my sensitivity from these incredible women. I'm not psychic, I'm not esoteric. I can only tell you what I experienced growing up. My house was a two-story, with an attic and basement. It was a big house with so many rooms. My first memory of the paranormal was when I was in kindergarten. I was walking upstairs to my room when I heard an old radio show playing from another upstairs bedroom. Our guest rooms had old radios and TVs that didn't work, but looked very vintage and cool. I sat down and listened, laughing at the jokes. When I rose back up and took one step up, the sound stopped. So I went back to the step I sat on and heard it again. When I stepped down to the next step, it was silent. I could only hear it from that step. I didn't always hear the radio when I stood on that step, but that step is the only place I heard it. There was a ghost I would play with on those steps too. A little boy in brown short pants with brown shoes and a white button-up shirt. He would appear when I was going upstairs, hanging his legs through the banisters along the upstairs landing. He would laugh and wave. Sometimes he would get up and run. My mom played with the same child ghost when she was little. Sometimes, when I was in my room sleeping, the sounds of a small party of people would wake me up. It was coming from the room where I thought the radio I heard on the steps would play. I would listen to people laughing, hear them moving around, smell cigarettes even though no one in my house smoked. I would get fed up after a while and stick my head out the door. I would ask them to keep it down. I had school the next day. The ghosts would go silent after that. I would see a tall, sad black woman in my basement. She wore a long, simple brown skirt with a reddish-pink skirt. She wore a white scarf on her head. Sometimes she would be weeping in the corner. I asked my great-grandmother about that corner, and she told me that the old house had a hidden tunnel that my ancestors would hide slaves in. While our house wasn't in the same location as the old house, the tunnel ran right through the spot where we would eventually have our basement. Back in 2015, my freshman year in college, my older sister and I became roommates and moved into a new home that she had bought. It was a nice home, fairly large for just two people. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, 2 living rooms, laundry room, dining room and kitchen. Now my sister is about 12 years my senior, so I found it odd that she would want me as her roommate. Being that she was in her early 30s and in a much more settled time in her life, and I was the typical college party animal staying up late, coming home at random hours of the night, with the occasional guest. We were total opposites. However, she told me I wouldn't have to pay rent or bills if I moved in, so who was I to say no? Plus it beat living at the dorms at my university. Upon moving in, I only took a while to get a clue as to why she wanted a roommate so bad. As nice as a house as it was, that home had some creepy and uneasy vibes to it that I picked up on fairly quickly. Maybe it was the fact that the place felt big for just 2 people, but almost immediately, I felt like I was never alone in that house. Like something was always watching me. But I never expressed these feelings to my sister. Not right away, anyway. The first few things I started witnessing were the moving dining room chairs. My sister had this set of dining room chairs that were relatively heavy for what they were. Like you actually had to apply some force to move the things in and out of wherever you were going to sit. And because they had some weight to them, they made a very distinct sound whenever you scrapped the wooden legs against the floor when pulling the chair in and out. One day I was in the TV room watching Netflix. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening and I was home alone. That particular day had been a lazy one, nothing lounging around for me. I'd watched Netflix for so long that I was no longer paying attention to the TV, but was rather fixated on my phone, scrolling through social media while the TV played in the background. So I was much more aware of background noise than I would have been if I'd been focusing on the TV. I was scrolling through Instagram and suddenly I heard a quick of the dining room chair being dragged. My eyes immediately focused towards the entrance of the TV room. Surely I was hearing things, right? I thought maybe my sister had gone home and had sat down without hearing her come in. But then again, this wasn't possible. She'd told me that she'd be at work at this time. I got up to go check who was in our home, but almost immediately I hear a much longer and louder smack. This one was the one that made my hair stand up and caused my heart to start beating fast. The first sound sounded as if someone had bumped into the chair. The chair had to have been dragged in order to make that second sound. Although my heart was racing, I can honestly say that I was about 20% scared, 80% intrigued. I opened the TV room door and peeked around the corner of the wall that allows me to see out the room, through the kitchen and partially into the dining room. Fuck me! The farthest dining room chair was leaning up against the wall in the back of the room. Someone or something had dragged the chair out and bumped it into the wall, which explains the smack I'd heard after the second sound. I stared out into the dining room for about a minute and had goosebumps almost throughout that time. I decided that I would not leave that TV room until my sister came home, so I turned around, locked the door, and got back under the blanket I'd taken with me. However, the chairs did not stop creaking, and I could clearly hear them moving around from time to time for the entire 2 hours that I waited for it to get home. That was the first paranormal activity, if that's what you want to call it, that I'd ever experienced, not just at home, but ever. I didn't tell my sister for some odd reason that I don't understand looking back, but those chairs moving would go on to become the norm for me. I'd be in any room and I could hear them move. I'd somehow accepted the fact that something is moving those chairs, but never really feared the fact that it was happening. And so life in our home kept going. A couple months went by with the typical chair activity, when one night I got woken up by a voice calling out to me. I still remember the sound of that voice till this very day, and I'm getting chills just reminiscing about it in order to write about it for you guys. The day this happened to me was on the final day of final exams for the fall semester, so the previous night I had spent pulling an all-nighter for the final 2 exams that I had on that day. I got home and from school around 3 p.m, opened my closet, which was on the left-hand side of my bed, threw my backpack in there and collapsed onto my bed. I was out almost immediately. Now, I'm someone that never sleeps with my closet doors open. I've always found it creepy since I was a kid from all the scary stories, so I just grew up that way. I was so tired from my all-nighter that day, I guess I didn't think about the doors being open when I fell asleep. Fast forward, it's now late at night. I'd slept through the whole day and was still in a heavy sleep. I was in my heavy state of sleep when I suddenly heard a very stern whisper say, "Hey." That woke me up. I remember sitting up in a sit-up type manner on my bed and looking at my left, and that's where I heard the whisper come from. I look over to my closet and it's pitch black compared to the rest of my room, and I noticed that the door wasn't closed. I wasn't spooked at all at first. I was sitting up in bed, looking around my closet and the rest of the room. I finally decided that I must have heard the voice in my dream. I'm just going to go back to bed. I lay back down, rested my head on the pillow, and immediately upon closing my eyes again to go back to bed, I heard it again. Only this time wasn't much of a whisper. "Hey," it called out to me from the direction of my closet. I shot out of bed and turned on my lights. This time I knew I wasn't dreaming voices. I had physically woken up and sat up in bed. I'd looked around. I wasn't asleep. This voice was very real and it was trying to make contact with me. I looked at my phone and the time was 4 a.m. I finally mustered the courage to close my closet door and I eventually dozed back off to sleep. But that voice still lingers in my memory from time to time, and it's made me into a believer that the paranormal is, in fact, real. When I was 14, I had a strange encounter that still puzzles me to this day. On the weekends, I'd sometimes go to my mother's place. My parents had divorced. The house she lived on was converted into several small apartments. It was a creepy old farmhouse. The house was at least 150, maybe 200 years old. My mom told me off and on of strange sounds that she had been hearing and seeing things in the corner of her eyes, feelings of being watched. This one particular evening, I spent the night I brought my N64 because my mom would go to bed early and I'd still be up for a few more hours. I still remember to this day what game I was playing, WWF No Mercy. I was sitting Indian style on the floor playing the story mode. I just finished a mission in the game and set down the controller to the left of me, behind me. Directly behind me was a recliner. I'll never forget what I saw next. I went to grab the controller and saw what appeared to be a hoof, like a horse next to the controller on the floor. Insects and blood were coming out of the silver that separated the hoof. I thought to myself, how strange. I slowly glanced up and this demonic figure was staring back at me. It leaned towards me, its face got down on my face and grinned the most evil smile. The eyes black, face red, one winged creature. Blood was dripping from its teeth. It was so surreal, I immediately went into a panic attack and blacked out. I learned later it was the fight or flight response. Several seconds later I came to, laying on the floor. I could barely move. The demonic figure was in the chair laughing at me. It was as if my fear and energy had been sucked dry from me. I lost all strength. I did all I could to crawl to my mom's room and woke her up. After I woke her up, we talked and she believed me. She told me that she too had seen the same thing earlier that week but didn't want to scare me. I don't want to make of it all and still think of it to this day. I've no doubt about demons and angels are real, and believe me, the last thing you ever want to encounter is a demon smiling in your face. When I was around 2 to 5 years old, my family used to live in a small apartment. We moved in our new home when my mum got pregnant. When we lived in the apartment, I didn't have a lot of friends since there were no kids my age living in the neighbourhood. There was no nursery in my small town, and obviously I wasn't old enough to go to school yet. So I used to play by myself and with my good friend Joe Bet. His name is relevant for later. The problem is I was the only one who could see and speak with Joe, and Joe was a grown-up man. We used to play with my Hot Wheels and we talked together. My mum would sometimes hear me have a conversation alone in my bedroom and come by and check who I was talking to, but could not see anyone in the room. Every time I asked, I answered, with my friend Joe. Up to this point, it would have been a pretty normal situation for a lonely kid to get an imaginary friend, and I would have thought that myself too if it stopped there. But the things got a bit stranger when my parents bought a house and planned to move out. I remember some of my Hot Wheels moving alone and some of my toys getting in the living room when we were not home. My mum also told me recently that she started to feel weird in my room at that time, like someone was watching her. My dad doesn't remember anything weird except some of my toys getting out of my room when we were not home, but as he said, he wasn't home often with his work, so we may have missed some clues. We moved to our new home and everything stopped. At first my mum assumed that my entry into kindergarten and me making friends was the reason why I didn't need Joe anymore. But the plot got even weirder. The other family who rented the apartment got in touch with my mom and started asking her questions about the apartment, and more precisely about my bedroom. Their son has got the same bedroom that I had, and like me, he started playing and talking alone in his bedroom. When his parents asked him who he was speaking to, he also answered, Joe. My mom told me that I did the same and answered the same when she questioned me about it. The only difference was his last name. I would always tell to my mom that his name was Joe Bet, and the other kid named him Joe Blow. In both cases, his name was Joe and his surname started with a B. It's a fairly strange coincidence if it is one. I still can't figure out exactly what was happening by that time, and if it was in fact a ghost or entity, or only just two lonely kids with a lot of imagination. At least Joe was a good guy and helped me get through my childhood. When I was around 8 years old, I first met my 3 friends who moved to the neighbourhood, which we have lived in for the past 20 years. The circumstances of them moving to the neighbourhood was loosely told to me growing up by them, but as they were kids at the time, they didn't really remember exactly what happened. A couple of months ago, I was at my friend's house and we were talking about paranormal activity we've experienced. That was when my friend's mother sat down and told me in detail what happened in their old home, which made them move to the neighbourhood. I knew it was crazy, but I didn't expect to hear what I did. I will try my best to detail all the things she told me. Apologies in advance for the bad spelling and grammar. This all took place in the early 1980s. As a young couple with a baby, they were looking for a council house. Council house is a form of public or social housing, built in by local municipalities in the United Kingdom, around the Nottingham area. They came across a neighbourhood which they wanted to live in and looked around the properties there. They were then informed of a house in that area which had become available. When they went to visit the house, they noticed that the door to the basement had been bricked up. The other houses in that area all had access to their basements. They thought it was odd, but nevertheless nothing concerning. From what I was told, the first couple of years which they lived in the house, nothing happened. It was just a normal house. The father was still studying electrical engineering, and the mother was a housewife. By this time, they had 2 more children. Later on, one of their neighbours who frequently visited the house told the mother that she sensed a bad spirit in the house, and they should get the house blessed. They didn't do so when they first moved in. My friend's mother agreed, but told me she regretted it deeply as all hell broke loose after that. She thought the events that transpired were caused by the blessing. The first thing which started to happen was my friend, who was the oldest at the time, started to become restless at night and complain that something was scaring him. My friend's mom thought it was just normal, as he just moved into his own room for the first time. But this started to become a daily occurrence, and she started to worry about him. It became that bad that he refused to sleep by himself. He said he saw a black woman with long fingers and frizzly hair in his room. Eventually, all three brothers would sleep in the same room. Later, they started to hear scratching and knocking noises in the house. The way she described the noises was like ticking on the windows and scratching noises in the corner of the rooms. This would last for minutes. She couldn't understand where exactly the noises were coming from. As the months went along, things became increasingly strange. She told me how they started to smell rotten fish throughout the house, and then it would just suddenly disappear. My friends, who were the oldest and youngest, were the ones who were greatly affected by the events in the house. The middle child had become attached to the spirit. He would frequently play by himself and talk to the spirits when his brothers weren't around. Later on, the father started to become a target. My friend's mom told me there was an instance where he punished the three boys, and especially the middle child, for doing something wrong. Later that night, he had a dream of getting chased by a demon dog, which ended up biting him. He woke up the next day with a giant bite mark on his chest. One of the most frightening things which she told me was that, at night, she felt that something was standing near the windowsill, and then it would jump on the bed, and then jump back on the windowsill. She would get up and start to pray as the bed was shaking, and it would eventually stop. They would also start to hear sinister laughing throughout the house, as if something demonic was taunting them. There were also instances where she saw paw prints on the kitchen floor as if a dog had been walking around. Only problem was that they didn't have a dog. They asked one of their uncles to house sit for them as they took the three kids for a day out. They wanted to get their minds off the events and have a normal day for a change. The uncle was told of what was happening in the house, but he was a skeptic. He said he would deal with what was in the house himself while they were gone. Later that night, when they arrived home, they were shocked to discover the front door wide open and all the lights in the house on. They phoned the uncle and asked him where he was. He told them that he challenged the spirit in the house and was thrown across the room. He started to hear laughing, at which point he ran out the door. As you can imagine, things became very desperate, so they contacted the local council and informed them of what was happening in the house. Eventually, a woman from the council came to visit their home to reassure them that they would do something to make it better. My friend's mother later learned that the woman who came to visit ended up in hospital with a mysterious illness and later refused to go anywhere near the house again. The meetings which they had subsequently all took place in a pub, which was half a mile down the road. Thankfully, the council found them another house, on the street where we live now. On the last day, when they were packing their things into the car to move out, the middle son was walking in the house by himself, without a care for anything. He was the only one who didn't want to move. The family later discovered that numerous couples had left the house after their departure. No one stayed in the house for more than a few months. After doing some research, they were informed by local people that a black woman with a dog had committed suicide in that house. From what I understand, the house is now a part of a Chinese takeaway. I have lived in this house with my husband and two teenage sons for 2 years now. Every one of us has heard the same thing, time after time. When sitting in the living room at night, you can hear what sounds like someone pacing back and forth on the front porch. Sometimes there will be light knocking on the door and the walls. When we check, no one is there. No wild animals, nothing that could explain the noise at all. We have kind of made a joke out of it. Oh, the ghost is back, haha. None of us are really true paranormal believers, although I am open to the possibility. Just skeptical. I want to explore all options before jumping to conclusions. Well, my mother has been staying with us for the past week and has been sleeping on a pull-out bed in the living room. She tells me that it goes on all night long and can actually get pretty intense. We are all always in our bedrooms at night, on the opposite side of the house, so we had never really experienced what she said. About an hour ago, my mother and I are watching a movie in the living room, about 10 p.m. where I live. My husband had gone out and the kids were playing Smash Bros in the back room. We had heard the pacing a few times and talked about it a little earlier. There was a few minutes of quiet and then 3 heavy, distinct knocks on the front door that sounded just like my husband had come back and had his hands full of groceries. So I reach over and open the door, still looking at the TV screen, and say, "You're back, come on in." Only no one comes in. We stop the movie and I look around outside. Nothing. My husband isn't back yet. Nothing else is around. My mum tells me again that this happens every night. I've never heard it so distinct, but she tells me it's happening every night. She then says, sort of jokingly, "I think there was someone out there that wanted in, and I think you just gave him an invitation." At this very moment, as soon as that proclamation left her lips, the light bulb flickered about 5 seconds and then blew out completely, leaving us sitting there in the dark. We both panicked for a few seconds and then kind of tried to laugh it off. We restart the movie we were watching, and for the rest of the movie, we heard no creeping around outside. I don't want to admit it, but I am feeling scared right now. I went to the bathroom and one of the bulbs in there had done the same flicker, but it didn't burst like the other. This isn't something that has happened before. It's not a wiring problem, at least not one that existed before the incident. From the time I was born until I was around 6 years old, my family and I lived in a townhouse close to the city's community college. It wasn't particularly old, and as far as my parents knew, the house had no dark past to speak of. There's a good chance the house was built on old farmland. I can explain this more in a second post if needed. And there was certainly a Native American presence in the area not long ago. But the house itself was totally normal. My parents moved into the house in 2001 and hadn't had anything out of the ordinary occur until after I was born, sometime around late 2004 to early 2005. This is the first odd experience my family had in the house, as told to me by my mom. My mom was very close friends with her supervisor. We'll call her Christy. Christy was over at our house quite often, since my mom often consulted her for help with her work, and she would usually bring her son over to play with me. On this particular day, it was just her. My mom and Christy were down in the kitchen, talking at the table. My dad was upstairs in one of the bedrooms, changing my diaper. My mom got up to use the bathroom, which was just across the hall from the kitchen by the front door, and Christy stayed at the table. As my mom was in the bathroom, out of nowhere she hears a woman's voice she doesn't recognise say something along the lines of, "Hello, handsome." My mom, thinking a neighbour has come over to say hello, thinks nothing of it, and when she comes out of the bathroom, she asks Christy if anyone's over. Christy looks at my mom, baffled, and tells her that no one else has entered the house, and that she hadn't heard the woman's voice. As Christy and my mum look around the house, puzzled, my dad comes downstairs holding me and asks, "Who stopped by to say hello?" He'd heard the same woman's voice. No one could figure out where the voice had come from, or how both my mum and dad, on 2 separate floors at that time, had both heard the same voice. Christy told my mum she got a weird feeling at the home, but my parents just wrote it off and figured it was just a strange coincidence. This proved to only be the beginning. It was around this time as well that my mum began capturing these strange balls of light in every picture she took in the house. Now my mum acknowledges herself that capturing a picture or two containing an orb is nothing out of the ordinary, considering orbs can be caused by dust and tricks of the light, but this was different. These orbs were appearing in every picture she would take. My mum cut the camera straps off her cameras, tried using disposable Kodak cameras instead of our digital one, got the house deep cleaned several times, took pictures in different parts of the house to avoid light contamination, and even bought an entirely new digital camera, but the orbs still appeared in every single photo. There are hundreds of photos sitting in albums in our living room with these massive orbs in them. These orbs show up again later in the story, but for the sake of trying to keep the timeline straight, I'll table this part of the story here. My mum hosted a group for mothers of young babies at our home, and Christy also happened to be a part of this group. One day, the group was over at the house and seated in a circle in our living room, when suddenly Christy looked up towards our couch and screamed, pointing towards it. She looked at my mum in a panic and shouts, "There is a man standing behind your couch." The rest of the group looks over and sees no one there. It wouldn't have been possible for there to have been someone behind the couch anyway. The couch was pushed up against the wall. Christy grabbed her son and ran out of the house. And although she and my mom remained friends, they haven't seen each other in years, but they're still friends on Facebook. Christy refused to enter that house ever again. Christy had seen the pictures containing the orbs, since they were actually pictures of me and her son together that showed the orbs floating around us. Seeing this man behind the couch was the last straw. She stuck to her word and never returned to the house for the remainder of our time there. It was around this time that my parents began to feel off in the house, especially when spending time in the basement and in my bedroom. My mom would try as hard as she could to avoid spending too much time in the basement. Both of my parents have told me that they felt like they were being watched as they tucked me into bed some nights. And then one day, the activity presented itself while my dad was at work. For a little backstory, not sure if anyone else has experienced this as a child, but I was absolutely obsessed with these classical music CDs called Baby Einstein. They had these weird puppet creatures that represented different artists and composers, and all of the CDs were narrated by the same woman whose name escapes me now. Anyways, I was in the living room asleep while my mom was in the kitchen cooking. She was playing one of the Baby Einstein CDs over some speakers we had, so I wouldn't wake up and bother her as she cooked. As she's cooking, she starts hearing what sounds like a woman talking over the music. My mom could tell it was not the narrator, since this woman sounded younger and was not talking during one of the pieces. The narrator only came on between the songs. Although my mom couldn't take out exactly what the woman was saying, she described it to me as hearing the woman having a conversation. She sounded happy, and my mom could hear the tone of her voice changing as she talked. At first, my mom thought maybe she was just overhearing someone talking outside, but when she peeked through the blinds to the kitchen window, she saw no one. Thinking maybe it was just coming from somewhere else, she walked out onto the deck, looking out into the forest behind the house. Again, no one. At this point, the woman had stopped talking, and my mom was beginning to be convinced what she was experiencing was something paranormal. After this, the activity around the house came to a head. There was one night my aunt was over with my mom, helping her out around the house while my dad was at work. Another quick bit of backstory, my room was very dark and it was sometimes very hard to hear what was going on up there from downstairs. For this reason, my parents bought a baby monitor to stick in my room so they would know if I was crying or if I wasn't sleeping well. This was long before the days of video monitors, so all this monitor had was a cheap microphone and some red lights that showed how loud the noise in the room was. Also in my room, sitting directly across from my crib, was an old rocking chair that my mom had inherited from her grandma. My aunt and my mom had just put me to sleep, and were sitting downstairs when they started hearing a noise over the baby monitor. At first they couldn't quite make it out, but very quickly realised what they were hearing. It was the sound of the rocking chair, creaking back and forth as if someone was sitting in it. The only person that should have been upstairs at the time was myself, but I was fast asleep. My aunt and my mom were downstairs, and my dad was still at work. The two stood up from their chairs in a panic, but as soon as they stood, the creaking noise stopped suddenly. They walked upstairs and into my room, and found nothing out of the ordinary. I was still fast asleep, and the rocking chair looked as though it had never been disturbed. They walked back downstairs, and as soon as they sat back down, the creaking started again. This cycle of creaking over the baby monitor, walking upstairs to find everything undisturbed, and then sitting back down and hearing the creaking start again, continued for about an hour, and it reached a point where my aunt was convinced we should leave the house and stay in a hotel for the night. Not too long after, my dad came home, and the creaking stopped completely. At this point, my mum was convinced that her and my dad's feelings of discomfort surrounding my bedroom were justified, and began looking for ways to solve the problem. Although my dad remained skeptical, my mum was convinced that what was going on in the house was paranormal, and began trying to find ways to reach out to whatever was in the house. At this point, my mum had accumulated hundreds of pictures containing the orbs, and wanted to see if she could capture something more compelling in a photo. One day, she decided to take the camera and point it at random spots in the house. Before snapping the picture, she said aloud, "Can you give me some sort of sign that you're here?" She snapped the photo, and as she looked down at the screen, she was shocked. In the picture, several separate balls of light appear in the center of the screen, up against the wall, but they appear in a straight horizontal line. She is ecstatic that not only did she capture something more compelling than an orb, she also managed to capture some sort of intelligence from what she was now convinced was a spirit living in our home. She tried asking for more signs, but in the absence of anything else, she began combing through the hundreds of pictures she'd already captured, looking for anything else that could show that these were more than just a trick of the eye or dust particles floating in the air. After a good amount of time searching, she found what she was looking for. A picture of me and Christie's son featuring an orb, but the orb was different. Inside the orb was the outline of what appeared to be some sort of face. She immediately began searching around the internet for paranormal investigators and contacted a team in the area to see if they'd be willing to come and check out the house. The investigators asked her to tell them about the experiences we'd been having, and although they were a little apprehensive, they finally agreed to check things out. Before coming out to investigate, the investigators told her that normally they would not be willing to come check out a house if all the residents had to show for the ghosts were pictures of orbs and personal testimony, but that they were convinced by both the sheer amount of pictures that my mom had and the two very bizarre photos, one featuring the line of orbs and the other featuring the orb with the face. The investigators did come over, albeit slightly skeptical, but they immediately began experiencing strange activity. Almost as soon as the investigators walked upstairs into my bedroom, all of their camera batteries died almost simultaneously. This actually freaked them out, with one of them looking at my dad and saying, "Your house is weird, man." These were all new batteries and they died in 5 minutes. The same thing happened down in the basement, with batteries dying left and right, affecting all sorts of equipment. Microphones and digital recorders picked up strange, staticky feedback, and their electromagnetic field readers picked up odd spikes, both in my bedroom and in the basement. My parents' suspicions about the house had been confirmed by professionals, and the investigators were convinced that there was something off about the house. After reviewing the evidence and doing some deliberating, the investigators told my parents that they wanted to return to the house a second time, this time with more equipment, since they were convinced there was more evidence to be captured. My parents eagerly set up the follow-up and waited. Now, this is where this story becomes a little muddy. I do 100% believe my mom, and the fact that my dad, a skeptic, backs her up on a lot of these stories makes it extra compelling to me. But this last part of the story has always left a bad taste in my mouth. My mom was a very spiritual person. She always believed in angels, certain stones carrying supernatural powers and the like. She's a therapist and a hypnotist, so I get it. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is to maybe take this final portion of the story with a grain of salt. Yes, it's odd, but I don't want to make assumptions about what was going on, and neither should you. I wouldn't be telling this story if I wasn't convinced it was real, but this final portion has always seemed a little odd. Anyways, my mum had set up a consultation with a woman claiming to be a psychic medium well before the paranormal investigators came over to visit the house. The appointment was only a week or so before the investigators were scheduled for their follow-up. Anyways, during the appointment, the woman asked my mom about the strange experiences we've been having in the house, and the medium told my mom that she'd picked up on the energy of a man in the house. She said he was lonely, and that he'd latched onto my family since he'd been over on his own. Obviously, this doesn't explain the woman's voices we heard in the house, but whatever. Like I said, this whole thing seemed a little odd to me. The woman asked my mom if she wanted her to either cleanse the house or leave it be. Knowing that the investigators were returning soon, my mom told the woman not to do anything to the house. She wanted to see what could be captured with more advanced equipment. The medium told her she wouldn't, but when my mom returned home afterwards, she noticed the entire house felt different. It felt like a heavy weight had been lifted out of the house atmosphere. She began to suspect that the medium had cleansed the house anyway. Not sure how that's possible, considering the medium never actually visited the house. Maybe someone in the comments can explain how this works. And her suspicions were only confirmed when the investigators returned for the second time and captured absolutely nothing. No strange EMF readings, no cold spots, no electronic malfunctions, nothing. Back in 2000, when I was 20, a friend of mine, female 19, decided she wanted to get an apartment and asked if I'd be her roommate. I didn't need a place to stay, but decided we'd do it anyway. We moved to a nice apartment complex right next to and behind the house where my aunt saw her dead ex-boyfriend. The place was nice and newer, so the thought of it being haunted never crossed my mind. I didn't even experience anything until my roommate got homesick a month in and had to move back in with her folks, leaving me there alone for about 3 months. It started with the lights coming on by themselves. I would go to bed, always turning the lights off and always closing my bedroom door. I was meticulous about the lights because that's how I was raised. I'd go to bed and at some point my eyes would see light coming in under the door. I thought my roommate came home, so I get out of bed excited to see her, only discover I was still alone and the dining room or bathroom lights would be on. Then the knocking started. Right after I'd lay down, there would be 3 loud knocks on my bedroom door. Again, I'd think my roommate had come home. I'd get up to greet her, only to see I was still alone. A week or so before Christmas, my roommate and I went out gift shopping and went back to the apartment to wrap everything. When we were done, we were both standing at the door, checking to see if we had everything before leaving. The apartment was completely quiet, and we heard this clearly. My acoustic guitar, which I had leaning up against my wall in the bedroom, with the pick stuck between 3 strings, was plucked, each string in succession, then slid along the wall until hitting the floor. We just looked at each other, then walked to my bedroom to find the guitar on the floor, with the pick still stuck between the strings. Those strings had been plucked, meaning the pick had been used, and then replaced when done. At Christmas, during a party with her and some other friends at the apartment, the VCR turned itself off. It did that 1 or 2 other times while living there, never before or after. For Christmas, my girlfriend got me a guitar tablature book for Pink Floyd's The Wall. One night, I sat on the floor of my bedroom learning how to play a song from it. When I was done, I put the pick in the strings and set my guitar up on the wall. But instead of closing the book as I normally did, I left it open and went to bed. Just after laying down, I heard the pages in the book flipping on their own. It was a thick book, but the song I had been learning was somewhere in the middle. I figured the weight of the pages made it change pages on its own. But when they stopped flicking, I got curious and got up to look. The pages stopped flipping on the song Hey You, and when I read the title, I got chills and shut the book, pleaded with the ghost to let me sleep, and I went back to bed. While laying there, I realized if the pages had flipped on their own from the weight, they would have gone the other way, away from that song. After that, I started calling the ghost Pink. Anytime something happened, I would just say, "Oh, hey Pink." But one night, I'd been out with a friend until about 2 a.m, and when I opened my door and stepped in, I could feel the ghost standing there. I said, "Oh, hi Pink," and I could feel the energy go through me and out of the apartment. So that's when I figured it didn't like being called that, which didn't stop me from saying it. Shortly after my roommate came back and stayed the rest of the lease, not much happened then. I figured if an entire house could be haunted, then surely an entire apartment or building could be. I wanted to ask my neighbours if they ever experienced anything, but I never did, and actually never really talked to them at all. And to answer some questions before they happen, my roommate and I are still really good friends. Never dated, never slept together. She was also really good friends with my girlfriend, and it was my girlfriend who told her to ask me to move in with. Also, I've known since I was around 10 or so that I could feel ghosts, but usually only when standing right there where they were. If I stand with them long enough, I usually get an image in my head of what they look like, as well as their mood. In a few instances, I've had them communicate with me like that, their words coming to me as thoughts or images, usually the latter. I usually don't tell people this because they usually don't believe me, and I'd just rather not go through with the ridicule and the name calling. However, with Pink, I never figured out who or what it was. I always felt that it was male, but I'm not sure. I still wonder about it from time to time. We'll start with about 2 months ago. I was sleeping in, My boyfriend was already at work. In my half-asleep state, I felt someone's hands as they pulled the blanket over my shoulders and placed my cat right next to my head on the pillow. Now, at first, I figured it was my boyfriend, but when I thanked him later that night, he insisted it wasn't him. I thought maybe he was messing with me, but then I remembered that it had been him if he would have kissed my head, and I clearly remember him doing so as he headed out the door sometime earlier. Next was a couple of weeks ago. I was sitting on my couch when a painting that hangs right over where my head was fell. It's not a big painting, but it would have definitely hurt if it smacked me on the head. It didn't though. Instead, it seems like it was pushed aside as it fell, so it ended up landing on the cushion beside me. This isn't the first time things have fallen off the wall. The drywall is very thin, so hanging things can be a challenge. At least now I know there's something looking out for me. And of course the cats. Oh, the cats. Well, those little jerks got in a fight a couple days ago. We were sleeping and very annoyed. I woke up and went to separate them. As my orange tabby tried getting away from her tuxedo brother, he chased her and stopped very suddenly, looking up, like looking at something. They fight like this all the time, but it doesn't stop until you force them away. To my tuxedo cat, it's playing, but the orange tabby doesn't like it. So I usually have to stand right in front of him and make him go somewhere else. I watched him from the stairs as he tried going through the living room doorway to get to where my other cat was, then get stopped and turned around. Like someone put their hands on either side of him and just flipped him around to look the other way. He huffed as cats do and stalked off back to the kitchen. And after saying a quiet thank you to midair, I went back to bed with Tabby trailing behind me. Whatever is in my house seems very kind but strong, which worries me a bit since I don't want to accidentally piss it off and have it come after me. I wonder if it's the ghost of someone who committed suicide, since that is tragically a regular occurrence in the military housing where we live. When I was little, my parents said I used to say I played with a little boy in the basement. My brother is 5 years older than me. It started when I was 6. I remember putting my shoes on with my dad to head to the gas station and looking down into the basement. At the very back where my brother's room was, there was a small dark shadow outside his door with glowing red eyes. My dad said, "Do you see it too?" We left. About a year later, I moved into the basement across hall from my brother's room. It was my first night down there. I remember waking up one day and seeing a little girl staring at me with red eyes. I was so scared, I couldn't even scream. I tried. I was crying though. My brother heard me crying and came out of his room to get me and our parents. The figure disappeared, of course. After that, I moved back upstairs next to my parents. My brother never reported seeing or hearing anything. Growing up, my household was hectic. A lot of darker energy could reside there, I think, based off what was happening there at the time. I don't feel comfortable going into it. I often escaped by PC gaming right after school and late into the night. I'd usually have headphones on one ear and off the other just in case my mom needed me or something got in the house. At this point, I heard a man's voice whenever I was in the basement. Gaming, it was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I wonder if maybe I was making it up. The computer desk was right across the laundry room, which also had a bathroom on the other side of the laundry room. So it goes me, laundry room, bathroom. The door to the laundry room suddenly started to swing open and closed, and the light in that room would switch on and off. Sometimes I thought maybe I left the light on when I went to the bathroom. After a while, I double checked I'd turned the light off, but the door would open and the light would turn on. I asked the spirit, dumb I know, but I was about 15 at this point, to keep the light off when I go to bed. And it did.